This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, we're talking about Wise Blood by Flannery O'Connor. Published in 1952, Wise Blood is Flannery O'Connor's first novel and shows many of the themes that would come to characterise her short but extraordinary career. The novel concerns the crisis of faith of Hazel Motes, who has just returned from the battlefields of the Second World War to his family home in a fictional city in the American South. Still recovering from the wounds he received in battle, Hazel has a series of disturbing, comic, violent encounters with an eccentric and unpredictable cast of characters. O'Connor viewed Wise Blood as a comic novel, though with a serious core. Hazel is a nihilist, but O'Connor puts him firmly on the path to redemption. Despite its cast of grotesques and the black humour on display, it is a work of complex religious themes, and has come to be known as a classic of 20th century American fiction. In his 99 novels, Burgess describes Wise Blood as a, quote, novel like no other. The individuality is intense, the comedy fierce, the truth undeniable. Flannery O'Connor was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1925. She studied at the prestigious Iowa Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa, and though we are discussing her first novel, she became known as a short story writer, most famously with the collection A Good Man is Hard to Find. Her second novel, The Violent Bear It Away, was published in 1960. Since her early death in 1964 at the age of 39, her legacy has grown. Her alma mater, Georgia College, opened the Andalusia Institute named after O'Connor's home in Georgia. The institute supports scholarship into the works of Flannery O'Connor, nourishes writing and the creative arts, hosts public events and resources for readers, including video discussions of Wise Blood. You can find the link to the Andalusia Institute's website in the description of this episode. To discuss Wise Blood, we invited Alison Arant onto the podcast. Alison is Associate Professor and Chair of the English Department at Wagner College in Staten Island, New York. Her research focuses on the American South, African American literature and women's literature. She has recently contributed to the collection Southern Comforts Drinking in the U.S. South with her essay on Black blues women, freedom and alcohol in the Prohibition South. Her most recent publication is Reconsidering Flannery O'Connor, which she edited with Jordan Colfer. This collection examines new theoretical approaches to O'Connor's work and interrogates established views of her fiction and legacy. It is available now from the University Press of Mississippi. The description of this episode contains all relevant links and a list of the books mentioned. Here's Will Carr of the Burgess Foundation, who spoke to Alison Arant in October 2021.
Hi, Alison. Welcome to the podcast, and thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Today we're going to be talking about Wise Blood, Flannery O'Connor's fantastic 1952 novel, and Flannery O'Connor more generally, because she appears as one of Anthony Burgess's favourites in his selection, 99 novels. But before talking about him, I wondered if we could talk a bit about you. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about how you first encountered Flannery O'Connor and Wise Blood, and what were your first impressions of her work?
I think the first time I read Flannery O'Connor was as an undergraduate student, although I know I knew her name before that. I was kind of a a book nerd child and managed to worm my way into a book club with a bunch of adults. I was the only, I think I was 14 or 15 when they kind of let me in. And one of the members of that book club, well, they had read a book, they had read Wise Blood by Flannery O'Connor before I ever joined. And I remember that it was controversial, that the person who recommended it really loved it, and the rest of the book club hated it. And so I think my first kind of awareness of her was that she was something of a lightning rod, which actually isn't a bad way, I think, to really come to her work. I think in some ways that kind of divided response continues to be something I see among readers and scholars of her work. So, but later on, I know I read her short story, "A Good Man Is Hard to Find," in a kind of entry level literature course in undergrad, and I think my response was kind of a combination of delight and shock and puzzlement. Um, I think I always have found her a very funny writer and a very engaging writer. She writes a lot about family scenarios where, kids sort of think they know better than their parents, and everyone's irritated with everyone, and people are in domestic spaces and kind of on each other's nerves. And so I think it's easy to relate to all of that. But then often she also has these kind of, well, pretty much, I would say almost formulaically, has these kind of jarring moments where, something happens, and it can be anything from a minor accident to something fatal, and that there is often that kind of turn where there's some sort of uh, action that is in some ways kind of both disruptive to what had been happening and even to kind of the previous mood of the story in some cases, but that also really is actually playing out what the previous parts of the story have been setting up. So those were some of my first impressions.
And well, that's interesting. You say that Wise Blood was a sort of controversial text, I suppose, even among the enthusiasts for O'Connor's work. I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit about Wise Blood itself. What's it about, and what could we expect to find in it?
So I would say I've been thinking about this, and I think to kind of put it in the simplest terms possible, I would say that Wise Blood is a novel about religious obsession. And the main character, Hazel Motes, is in a lot of ways obsessed with repudiating Jesus. He's a returning World War II veteran who has just completed 4 years of military service. And I think that, sort of strangely, perhaps, his desire to reject Jesus comes out of kind of a deep grappling with this awareness of Jesus as this kind of all demanding figure. So Hazel had a grandfather who was a fundamentalist preacher, and O'Connor writes that Jesus was hidden in his head like a stinger. And I think even that line kind of gives you a sense of the kind of just the electrified quality that Jesus has for Hazel. So the grandfather kind of preaches Jesus as this soul hungry figure and very totalizing in his passion for the soul of every sinner, very determined to have every sinner in the end. And he kind of preaches Jesus as this inescapable, all demanding, disorienting figure. And I think that, kind of ironically, that's in some ways what prompts Hazel's efforts to reject Jesus. So O'Connor writes that when Hazel was 12, he knew he would be a preacher. But what ends up happening in the course of the novel is that Hazel becomes something of an anti-preacher, and he founds what he calls the Church of Christ without Christ, and preaches that, and has a lot of encounters where he's kind of badgering people about their belief in Jesus in one direction or another, even as he's, ultimately uh, arguing that, Jesus didn't matter, and that there's no such thing as the fall, because there's nothing to fall from, and there's no such thing as redemption because there was no fall. So but it's kind of apropos of nothing that he's having these encounters with people, and bringing up Jesus in the first place. So it's like he sort of raises the question only to kind of try to argue against it, but in most of the cases, or in many of them, no one else is even talking about Jesus. So I could say more about the plot, but I really don't want to spoil it too much for people who haven't read it.
No,
But
don't spoil the plot. But
I
no,
won't.
you're given a sense of the kind
Yes.
of the environment of it, I suppose, of the landscape of the novel, which is this. I mean, I hesitate to use the phrase Southern Gothic, but I mean, it is set in a southern place in a southern town or city,
Hmm.
and there is this religious culture, I suppose, that Hazel
Absolutely.
Motes keeps bashing up against, keeps
That's right.
having conflict with.
That's right.
Um, Do you think this is representative of Flannery O'Connor's other fiction? I mean, is this the world that she keeps returning to?
I think so. I would say in many ways it is. I think that the many of her preoccupations, her Christian preoccupation, I think that the dark humor of the book and I think its violence are all pretty consistent with O'Connor's work on the whole. I reread it in preparation for our conversation today, and I think it did strike me as in some ways darker than other O'Connor works. It's if someone asks me about O'Connor and asks for a recommendation, I don't necessarily say go read Wise Blood, although I think there's nothing wrong with diving in with Wise Blood, but I would kind of probably recommend someone dipped their toes into the short stories and then if they like that kind of continue to Wise Blood because I think it's a book that really foregrounds ugliness in a lot of ways, which I think can be fun for some readers and maybe off-putting for others. Like truly almost every character who gets introduced, you get told sort of what's ugly or unattractive about them.
They're
I,
grotesques, aren't
yeah,
they?
the
They,
grotesque. I think that's right.
yes.
It really does lead with the grotesque, almost to the exclusion. Not. I mean, I think there are some sort of striking descriptions of the sky at different points, and it's not as though it's completely a world devoid of beauty, but it is a grotesque world that she creates, and so for readers that like that kind of thing, they'll like it, and for others, perhaps not.
It is certainly an intense experience
That's right.
reading all of Wise Blood, and yes, I can see why you might point towards some of the short fiction, which are perhaps, well, I suppose Wise Blood itself was made up of a number of shorter
That's
pieces
right. That's
to
right.
begin with,
Hmm.
and so the cumulative effect is quite a lot to take on, perhaps,
Hmm.
but and maybe that's one of the reasons why it is not always liked, even by enthusiasts for O'Connor's work. How do you think the novel was received when it first appeared?
I would say there was a mixture. I mean, on the one hand, O'Connor was trained at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and so by virtue of that experience, she was really already well connected to a lot of literary tastemakers. She was in proximity to Robert Penn Warren and Cleanth Brooks and Alan Tate and others, and so in that way, I think she was getting a lot of encouragement both publicly and privately from some pretty influential writers and figures, people like Robert Lowell and Caroline Gordon and J.F. Powers. Um, R.W.B. Lewis wrote a 1953 review where he compared Wise Blood to Kafka and to the work of Nathaniel West. In 1958, the publication Critique devoted part of their issue to her work. So there was, I think, some recognition on the part of members of the literary establishment that it was a serious novel and a great novel and an important one. On the other hand, I think probably closer to home for O'Connor, there was a much more mixed response. You can read in Jean Cash's biography about how it kind of horrified the locals in Milledgeville, where O'Connor was living at the time. And there are some pretty funny and kind of, if you think about it from Flannery O'Connor's standpoint, maybe kind of sad anecdotes about how family members of hers would buy the book and send it to priests that they knew, and then they would go on to read it themselves. And then they would write back to the priest and say, please send that book back and don't read it because they found it disturbing. There's a story about how the Georgia College, her alma mater, asked her to do a reading from Wise Blood, and she did. And then there was a kind of like, well, we'll never do that again kind of response to it. So I think for a lot of people who knew her and her family, there was a kind of a real kind of horror of the book, and maybe even some shock that someone who was a Catholic and a devout Catholic at that would write a book that involved a lot of violence and sex. And it's not as though the book goes into kind of gory depictions of the details of those things, but it's definitely there and it's unmissable. And I think, if you're someone who's very concerned with not offending people, it wouldn't be your thing. So I think that there is that, and I think too in the local press, local newspapers and so on, when they covered it, would say things like, what a promising, nice young writer, and we look forward to when she'll write about nice people. So I think people kind of had a framework for thinking about maybe Southern white women in particular and the kinds of books they expected them to write. And this was not in that mold. And so um, I think even as the literary establishment did kind of recognize it and praise it, there were people who felt, offended and lost and kind of everything in between.
Well, that it didn't stop her, of course. I mean,
No.
she went on to write. Well, I mean, the short stories is what she's most known for, perhaps, or most immediately
I
known
think
for.
that's right. Yes.
And it seems I've been trying to find out about Anthony Burgess's reading of O'Connor. It seems he did read quite a lot of it. He reviewed Everything That Rises Must Converge very positively in 1965,
Hmm.
and and obviously Wise Blood appears in his selection here. She's a writer that he keeps coming back to, um, and so by the mid 80s, when he's compiling his sort of overview of 20th century literature, I wondered what sort of reputation her novel and her other writing might have had by that point.
Hmm. Well, as I mentioned, she was well connected in terms of the literati. And so, one of the stories that people mention sometimes is that when she was training at the Iowa Writers Workshop, she read Understanding Fiction, which was edited by Robert Penn Warren and Cleanth Brooks. And they were both people she was connected to through the writers workshop, and one of her own short stories was in the next edition. So she, in a lot of ways, is kind of embraced and becomes a fairly canonical writer, even in her own lifetime. Although it's probably worth mentioning, in case some people aren't familiar, that she did have a short life. She died at 39 from complications related to lupus. um, and so, I think even at the time when Burgess was reviewing Everything That Rises Must Converge, that's already a posthumously published work of hers, because she passes away in 1964. So book length studies of O'Connor's work did begin to appear in the late 60s and 70s. And then I think the more work came out. Mystery and Manners was published, which is a collection of her occasional prose, that comes out in 1969 at the behest of her literary executors, Robert and Sally Fitzgerald. Then you have the publication of the complete stories in 1971, and that makes her short fiction available in chronological order. That also includes some of the short stories that were later turned into Wise Blood. And then the Flannery O'Connor Bulletin is founded in 1972 at her alma mater, Georgia College. That publication eventually becomes the Flannery O'Connor Review. And so there's really already a pretty sizable critical conversation happening about Flannery O'Connor by the 70s, and certainly by 1984. 1979, John Huston makes a film adaptation of Wise Blood, and that comes out. And so there's definitely, I think, a real readership for it, both a kind of popular readership and a scholarly readership.
Did the popular readership, do you think, come to terms with what Flannery O'Connor was doing? Because there's quite a lot of difficult stuff to deal with, not least the religious content, which is very foremost, I think, in Wise Blood. And indeed, Burgess describes Wise Blood as an essentially religious novel. And how far do you think people responded to that? And do you think that is, in fact, a good description of what she's doing?
I do think people responded to that, although I think that, again, those responses are kind of mixed. You may know that the second edition of Wise Blood, when it's renewed 10 years after, so it's published in 52, and then there's a second edition that comes out in 1962, where O'Connor writes a kind of prefatory note that is, in a lot of ways, a kind of authorial clarification of her own intent, because I think the book, you know. It's complex, and I think it sets up a lot of binaries, and then it collapses a lot of those same binaries. And so I think it's a novel that's very possible to read, kind of, with an affirmative religious vision as the conclusion, or with the opposite. And I think, even in O'Connor's own lifetime, people are kind of picking up on that, and arguing that, like, while she may see herself as writing with a Catholic sensibility, some readers found, a kind of demonic vision in the book. And John Hawkes wrote to O'Connor. He was a correspondent of hers and also a reviewer of hers, and ended up making the argument that O'Connor, despite her own stated Catholicism and her stated intentions, was more of the devil's party than not in her fiction, and kind of argued that it didn't even really carry out her own vision, that the book kind of did something different. And so I think it ends up attracting both kinds of readers. I think there are the people who read it because of the depth and the seriousness with which it grapples with questions of faith. And then I think it's possible to read it, kind of about the ways that religious obsession can miscarry, can destroy lives, can, just, I guess, the dangers of fundamentalism would be one way think about it and to read it. And then, all kinds of people, punk bands, people like it for all kinds of
Yes,
reasons and
indeed.
draw lines from it, take lines for their band names, for their song lines, and so on. So I think lots of people find lots of things to respond to, not all in the kind of realm of what O'Connor herself would have identified herself as doing, but I think she would have liked that too. I think she was a serious enough writer and interested in having a readership that even kind of what Robert Donahue has called heathen or misreadings, I think were not unwelcome for her.
That's really interesting. Yes, she does seem to allow for well, a kind of openness of interpretation.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you say about some critics imagining she might somehow be of the devil's party, because
Uh-huh.
Burgess himself was, well, he's interested in these questions. I suppose his novel Earthly Powers is very concerned with the possibility of the Pope perhaps being an emissary of the devil, and
Hmm.
what implications that might have for the Catholic
Yes.
Church. And so
Yes.
it's very much sort of grappling with similar material, maybe, but
I can
albeit in
see
very
that.
different
Yes.
ways. Um, Burgess does quote O'Connor very approvingly when she talks about her own work, and I'm going to read it out now. I think she says that the fiction writer presents mystery through manners, grace through nature, but when the fiction writer finishes, there always has to be left over that sense of mystery, which cannot be accounted for by any human formula. And perhaps this relates to the open-endedness that we were talking about. But I wondered if you felt that statement captured some of what she achieves in her work.
I do think so. I think especially that can be a fruitful way to read. I think that the best readings don't try to overly resolve that mystery or, kind of murder to dissect. I think that unfortunately, there can be some critical impulses to do that at times. And I think O'Connor kind of creates a tricky scenario for readers because I think, on the one hand, her work can be so disorienting that I think a lot of readers can feel like they want some kind of guide or they want someone to explicate it for them. They know they've had a strong and powerful experience, and now there's the kind of what does it mean question. And I think that interest, rather than kind of actually grappling with the book, can make us want to, I mean, take to the internet now or figure out what other people have said and kind of resolve it for ourselves. But I think in some ways, to if a reader has the sort of presence of mind to sit and grapple, that perhaps might be more fruitful. I think, though, it's been interesting to watch because I think O'Connor in a lot of ways did more to explicate her own work and clarify her own intentions than a lot of artists will. And I think in some ways that has kind of I think it's had a way of forestalling our engagement with mystery in her work, because I think it can get really reduced to the formulaic. And I think that a lot of critics in particular, not all, certainly there have been a number who have kind of argued for that openness and made wonderful and important inroads along those lines for a long time now. But I also think there can be a kind of tendency to think that because you can find essays and letters where she really kind of lays out her own understanding of what she was doing, that you could eliminate some of that mystery or sidestep some of the discomfort that her fiction can give rise to. But I would try to, I mean, it might be the teacher in me, but I would try to argue hard for the good of a deeper grappling than that, to not kind of try to just quickly find a resolution or some sort of explanation that says this is why this violence is actually grace and it shouldn't bother you or whatever. I'm not kind of I think one of the quick summations people often sort of offer for O'Connor is that her fiction is doing kind of like transformation through violence, or grace through violence. And so I think even that can be reductive in a way that, although that's a kind of complex proposition, um, I think even that can have a way of forestalling our engagement with mysteries. So I think she's right to name those dynamics, but I think that the best reading will sit with them rather than trying to resolve them.
Well, yeah, and I felt that. I mean, even some of her imagery invites that kind of very, well, almost simplistic interpretation. Sometimes, there's the bit in Wise Blood where a cloud comes to Hazel Motes, and it's lit by this blinding light, and it looks like it's got a beard. And
Yes.
you kind of, well, this symbolism is pretty much on the nose, I think.
Yes.
But at the
Yes.
same time, well, during the reading experience, I at least was quite happy to sit with that. I didn't really mind, because it's wrapped up in this very kind of complicated and unsettling and quite disturbing world. You don't feel like you're being preached to.
Uh-huh. I think
And
that's right.
I certainly found that very exciting to read.
Good.
Um, I wondered if we could talk about another thing that Burgess says, and indeed O'Connor says, about Wise Blood, which is that it's a comic novel. And you've already mentioned that some critics identified Wise Blood as such on publication and compared it indeed to Kafka. I wondered if you could say a little bit about the comedy in the novel, and perhaps in O'Connor's work generally, because it's quite unexpected, I think.
I think that's true. I mean, I think there are some lines in the book that are funny in a straight ahead way, and would make almost any reader chuckle. But I also think that, on a kind of deeper level, a lot of the comedy in the book is dark comedy, and I think, it comes from an awareness that, um, that kind of laughter or a recognition of humor are in some ways sort of counterintuitively, uh, logical responses to pain, to tragedy, to, kind of big questions, and even just to human foibles and ridiculousness. I mean, I think a lot of the comedy comes from irony, and the way that, there's just a series of reversals. Hazel exists, I think, as a foil to a lot of other characters in the book, and as a double to a lot of other characters in the book. And so some of the comedy comes from that. But then there's just kind of straight ahead funny things, even some slapstick things. The book has a person in a gorilla costume who shakes hands with people, and, it's one of the kind of funnier, the Ganga scenes, I think, are some of the funnier scenes in the book. Um, but
There's
a
a
lot
kind
of
of
it,
sorry,
no, no,
continue.
please.
Well, I was just going to point out the absurdity of it, I
Yes,
suppose,
I
because
think
it's
that's right.
I suppose when I was reading it, I found it so kind of unexpected, discombobulating, those kind of, yeah, the gorilla
Yes,
suit
I think that's
scene,
right.
or Hazel, again, I'm probably spoiling it, but Hazel disposes of one of his rivals by running him over in his
That's
car
right.
over and over again. It's
Yes.
kind of,
Overkill.
there's a sort of madness to it.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think Kafka and O'Connor are both really interested in religious strangeness. And even though I think they're thinking seriously about it and taking it seriously, you can't help but recognize how absurd sometimes the claims of religion can seem from certain vantage points, even to the devout. And so I think there's a way in which the books kind of lay that out. And I think, it's both kind of serious and funny.
And one of the words Burgess uses to describe the comedy is that it's fierce, which I thought was
Mhm.
quite an interesting word in relation to Wise Blood, because, well, the hat that Hazel Motes wears throughout is described as a fierce hat. I think that happens 5 or 6 times. And he describes her life as having been fiercely lived. It just struck me as quite a luminous phrase, and I wondered if you felt it was a useful way of thinking about O'Connor as a fierce writer.
I love it. I think that it's a great way of thinking about O'Connor, and I think you could almost sort of pick your index of her ferocity. I think she's kind of ferocious on several levels. I would say, as a writer and as a craftsperson, she was ferocious in revision. I think she rewrote Wise Blood over a 5-year period, and her drafts are available in the archives now. And so some scholars pore over those, and kind of look at how the work evolved, and there are lots and lots of drafts, and she held herself to very high standards, and that took a ton of work. So she was a disciplined writer and a serious and ferocious reviser. She took pretty serious feedback from other writers that she trusted, and she would really rework things, based on, the input that she was getting. So I think that's one index. I think another index of her ferocity is the way that all the work that she did while she had lupus, as I referenced, which is a disease that had killed her father when she was a teenager. Um, and like all chronic and degenerative conditions, it was painful. It required ongoing treatment that had its own set of side effects and difficulties. So she was doing all that work while she was experiencing a lot of pain and discomfort. She ended up on crutches at points in her life, and it caused a lot of swelling in her body. And so I think it takes ferocity to kind of continue to sit and do your work while your body's going through a lot of pain. So I also would highlight her ferocious wit. I think anyone who's had a chance to dip into her collected letters will find what a funny writer she is. And I think critical of herself as well as um, the people around her. But I think not just that, but I think loving too in a lot of ways. Um, but just a keen observer, and um, yeah, a funny personal writer too, I think. Um,
I certainly got the impression with this work and some of her others that it never rests.
yeah, yeah,
There's no let up,
yeah.
and
I think that's right.
for me that was quite a strong indication of her fierceness, of her
Yes,
ferocity.
that's a good way to
You
describe it.
you don't get a break really,
Yep, yep.
from what you're saying, it sounds like she didn't give herself much of a break.
I
You know,
think that's
she,
right. I do. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, and maybe no, I mean, having, like I said, having kind of seen her father die, I'm sure she had some sense that it could take her life and end her life at even a young age. So perhaps, I don't know totally what role that played, but I think, and of course, we all live knowing we'll die. And yet, I think to have kind of a more immediate cause at hand can feel, especially like it adds that intensity. So,
Well, it certainly seems like it burnt very brightly for her.
yes, yes.
And and as you say, there was a gathering interest in her work during her lifetime and after her death. But now it's been a while now, 70 years since Wise Blood was written, and obviously her work and her legacy is still being reassessed. But I wondered if you could just say something about what you thought O'Connor's reputation is today, and what contemporary readers might take from it.
I would say that on the one hand, her reputation is alive and well. I've heard people say that of all American women writers, O'Connor gets the most critical attention. As I mentioned, she has a scholarly journal dedicated to her work, and there's certainly a stream of ongoing critical and popular engagement with her work. She gets name checked by the Coen brothers and Bruce Springsteen and Lucinda Williams. And so, on the one hand, I think alive and well. I think the work of the Flannery O'Connor Review and of Bruce Gentry in particular, with the work that he's been doing in the National Humanities Institutes that have, there have been two of them, one in 2007 and one in 2014, which I participated in, which I think have done a lot to kind of keep trying to consider what else O'Connor's fiction could mean. I think that work has done a lot to kind of call scholars to fresh readings and new ways of approaching her. So on the one hand, on that hand, I think things are going well. On the other hand, I think, as I mentioned, because there is so much of kind of O'Connor reading O'Connor, there can be, I think, a tendency on the part of some to sort of take a calcified approach to her work, or to produce readings that are sort of just saying once again, yes, she was a Catholic writer, yes, she was a Southern writer. Um, and I think that can have a kind of narrowing effect. And so, as I mentioned, I think a lot of work is also being done to kind of keep steering us in new directions, and not just to kind of consider how she understood her own project, but to really consider what the work itself suggests, and to give it kind of the broadest set of readings that it can have, and that I think it deserves and that it invites. So I think I would also mention that I think this has been an important, just even in the last few years, it's been an important time for naming the ways that white supremacy and that racial segregation shaped O'Connor. And I think that really should come as no surprise to us, that she didn't transcend her context in thinking about race and writing about race. I see us all as affected by white supremacy, and I see us all as needing to unlearn the ways in which our context shapes our conscious and unconscious ways of thinking about race. So I don't think of that as a reason not to read O'Connor, but I also really don't think of it as a thing to pretend doesn't exist, or that you won't find. Um, I think one reason that readers have been surprised to learn about some of the racist comments that you can find her making in personal letters, or even the ways that I think from a 21st century standpoint, her own fiction can make readers uncomfortable. I think part of the reason why that surprises some people is because I think parts of her letters and her archive have been controlled by family and friends, and I think there has been a kind of tendency on the part of some editors um, and people in charge to kind of remove some of the casual racism from O'Connor's personal correspondence or kind of downplay it. I also think there are some people who really admire O'Connor to the point where they want her to stand for, I think a kind of serious and compelling religious figure in a context that might feel devoid of people that have that kind of level of, I don't know, respect maybe that they command. But um, I think if that leads to some sort of impulse to claim that she wasn't racist or that her work doesn't kind of present race in troubling ways, that's misguided. So I think I guess at the same time I would say I think her work, if you read it straight through from the earliest things she wrote to the latest things she wrote, I do think you see development and progress in her thinking around racism. I think she moves from using racist stereotypes in her fiction. And I've written about, in my essay in the collection, deals with a short story that she wrote as an undergraduate student called The Place of Action, where she writes about Black people wearing zoot suits, and it's just full of racist stereotypes. But that's also really early, and I think you can contrast that with her late fiction, which is, I think, critical of the racism of white people, and even kind of using that as the butt of kind of the stories that she's writing. And I think you can also see her recognizing the ways in which race is socially constructed and questioning that. So I think there is progress there, and I think it's important to recognize that her thinking does what I hope all kind of serious people will do, which is, keep examining themselves and keep growing. But I'm troubled by especially on an impulse on the part of critics to kind of try to say she wasn't racist or explain it away or just say she's a product of her time, as if those things kind of should mean it doesn't trouble us. I think for some readers it's even the fiction itself and the way that characters in dialogue will use the N word and so on, yeah, is such that they don't even care to engage it. And I think on some levels I can understand why people would feel that way. um, I still think her fiction has a lot of powerful things to offer. I would say it's still worth reading if you are not put off by that. I think one thing I would say or highlight, I guess, in terms of what her work has to offer, and maybe especially to our moment, is that it has, I think, an insider's critique of where religious faith can distort into destructive self-righteousness, and I think that's rare. I think we so often think of kind of critiques of religion coming from the outside. But I think O'Connor is, in the same way that she's fierce about a lot of things, I think she's fiercely critical of the church, but as someone who loves it, not as someone who would say we're better off without it. And so I think the ferocity of her critique made some people again kind of question whether her fiction was really doing what she thought it was doing. But I think to kind of listen to that insider's observation about the way that even kind of being she writes famously, a good man is hard to find. And a story like that kind of takes this idea of religious goodness and shows kind of how even attempts to be good can be so kind of morally corrupting or distorting. And that's profound. That's, I think, complicated and again kind of worth sitting with and worth struggling with. So those are a few pieces that I would kind of highlight about her legacy, thinking about it at this vantage point.
Well, that's great. Thank you for addressing those questions so directly, because I mean, none of this is easy, and I don't think Flannery O'Connor is alone actually
No,
in
I think that's right. Yeah.
in this.
That's
But
right.
there's, and it's clear to me at least that there's every reason to continue to read her work, and I can see, from our conversation and from what others have written about it, that there's plenty to unpack even now.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, Before we end, though, I wondered. Well, as you know, in this selection, Anthony Burgess picked 99 of his favourite novels. So we were wondering. We're going to ask everyone this: what should the 100th be? What would you pick if you could?
Mm. My pick for the 100th book would be The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, which was published in 1970. And I'll just highlight two reasons that this one would make my list. I think the first is just the way that I think Morrison really refuses to dehumanize any of her characters. Even, it's a novel that also involves really difficult things. It involves incest and rape, and a father who rapes his own daughter. And I think even in writing about that most difficult thing, Morrison never she insists that writers, I think, sit with how this father, Charlie Breedlove, kind of became a person who would do this in a really humanizing way, without letting him off the hook, I think, at all, but without kind of turning him into a monster. And I really admire that. I think that's, how do you kind of write about some of the most horrendous things that people can do to other people, without kind of going into one ditch or the other. So I admire how she does that. I think there's a lesson in there for all readers, and not in excusing it in any way, but also not in kind of turning it into a reason to see someone as completely different from any way we could see ourselves or anything that we could become. So I think that's one kind of profound contribution that the book makes. I would say that the other is just the way that it makes white ideology visible. I think I'm a white woman, and I think that for me, in my own kind of thinking through questions of race, I think it's been a profound book. I never knew Toni Morrison personally, but I feel like she's been my teacher in thinking about how so many of the things that for me were just kind of part of life as a default or just the way things were, turn out to be pretty far from just the way things are, but are actually ways we've made things to be. So it's a book that kind of makes readers think a lot about beauty standards and the way that the blue eye of the title shapes how the main character, the young black girl Pecola Breedlove, how she sees herself and what she ends up wishing for her life. And so I think it's an amazing book on a lot of levels, and a book I would recommend heartily to anyone who hasn't read it yet.
Well, thanks, Alison. That's fantastic. And well, before I close, I just want to point towards your book, which is Reconsidering Flannery O'Connor, edited with Jordan Kofer, and that's with the University Press of Mississippi. Came out last year, and it's
That's right.
Fantastic, wide-ranging collection of new approaches to Flannery O'Connor. Much to get into, I think, and
I hope.
and it shows where O'Connor scholarship is up to right now. Thank you so much for joining us, Alison.
My pleasure.
That was
Thank
great.
you. It's great to speak with you.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Reconsidering Flannery O'Connor, edited by Alison Arant and Jordan Kofer, is out now from the University Press of Mississippi. You can find links to more information about Flannery O'Connor in the description of this episode. For more about Anthony Burgess and to find out how you can support the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit www.anthonyburgess.org. The theme music is Anthony Burgess's Concerto for Flute, Strings and Piano in D minor. It's performed by No Dice Collective, who can be found online at nodicecollective.com. If you'd like to join the conversation and choose your 100th novel to add to the list, you can use the hashtag 99novels on Twitter. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts?